we're going to talk about developing for accessibility. So this is a talk that I gave at ThunderPlains last year, and I modified it a little bit for this group. But the talk was a fun talk. A lot of people showed up, and it was a really great environment. It was not recorded, it was not streamed, and if you didn't stick around on Friday at 4 p.m., like, you probably may not have wanted to do, then this is your chance to get that talk. So I'm really excited to do this, and it's a great topic. Also, shout out to ThunderPlains for having 3 accessibility talks last year. That was really, really exciting to see. So we're specifically going to talk about developing for accessibility. That accessibility is a big topic. We're not going to cover everything. We're not going to cover a lot of design-focused things, because as developers, we have a say in everything a lot of times, but we have 100% say in the development work. So that's what we're going to focus on. Now, take a deep breath, because this is going to cover a lot. You're going to learn a lot, and that's okay, because this talk really has one focus, and it's going to try to teach you some actionable things that you can learn to apply to your projects today. It's all really front-end oriented as well. Now, you're not expected to be an accessibility expert, and I think this is kind of the big thing. I think accessibility is it's almost like a buzzword in development these days. Like, you kind of are assumed that you not only do it, but you know what it all means and everything, and that's really not the right way to think about this. It's like you didn't just jump into your job as a programmer to know how to code. You learn stuff as you go. So it's the same thing with accessibility. Like, give yourself the grace to learn this stuff and just get better every day, just one step at a time. So this talk will be about 40% talk and 60% demo, and we'll get to that pretty soon. So who am I? I'm Aaron Krauss. I like tea. I like longboarding. That's actually what I'm drinking here, is a nice tea with a ton of honey in it. So if I do get on a coughing spit, then I have that. I like longboarding, and I like my random hobby of the month. That is a genuine thing right now. My random hobby is learning language, like spoken languages. I spoke German as a kid, so I'm kind of relearning German the right way, because I know how to speak it pretty colloquially, but not formally. And that'll surely change, like, by March, and I'll find something else. In the past, it's involved like writing family recipes down on index cards. I got into origami for a while. It really does just change. I have a beautiful wife and a beautiful son. My wife is also an organizer of She Codes OKC. My son is 2, so he is not. No, I'm sorry, he will be 2 on Friday. I've been a professional developer in Oklahoma City since 2011, so I've gotten to see this community really evolve. It has been a lot of fun. I'm currently a technical lead of new development at this company that we're at physically right now. It's called Clever. We do a lot of software consulting. We also have some internal products that we're working on, software related. But software consulting is predominantly what we're doing right now. So we work with big clients nationally, locally. Some of them are small clients as well, and it's a lot of fun, a lot of different projects. I've been involved in Techlahoma for a while. I've been an active speaker since about 2014. I used to be a board member back in like 2018, 2019, and I'm currently a user group leader of this group with Steven, and of Coffee and Code to an extent. Kimberly Collins definitely manages the greater group, but I certainly host a meetup here and there. So, all that aside, what are we actually going to talk about today? We're going to talk about developing for accessibility. It's a tea break, real quick. We're going to be doing that a lot. So, what is accessibility? Well, you've probably seen this acronym before, A11Y, and you may know what it means, but if you don't, it's the letter A, 11 characters, and the letter Y, so we can say this ally. You can probably pronounce it ally as well. But you're going to say accessibility. But you'll see that quite a bit. Accessibility, to me, means caring about people, and that means all people. That includes users with disabilities, and users with no disabilities at all, and I think you'll probably start to see that throughout this talk. So developing an accessible site will make your site better in general. It literally architects your site in the right way. That's kind of what developing for accessibility really means, is doing things the way they're intended to be done, and you'll get to see some of that. It's probably also required as well. So there's some things you've probably heard in passing, like Section 508 and the ADA. Section 508 refers to Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which I believe came about in like 98, and it's been revamped since then. But that applies to federal governments and federal agencies. So if you are working either with that field or in that field, then Section 508 applies to you. But if you're not in that field, you still have to abide by the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which really applies the same general legalities to the public sector and like the private sector as well. So state agencies, but also businesses like Clever and everything. So it's really, if you're doing anything for any like professional reason, you pretty legally need to care about accessibility. And this is not like anything scary. It's kind of just like, let's get this on your radar and kind of know what to do next. So before we can actually start developing for users who do have disabilities, we need to actually understand what the different types of disabilities are that are out there. And they really get lumped into 4 major categories. You have visual disabilities, motor disabilities, meaning function with your body, auditory disabilities, and cognitive disabilities. And these first 2, visual and motor, are the types of disabilities that we can very much develop for. You can develop for the other ones as well. Auditory is kind of if you use, there's a lot of tools out there that you can implement as opposed to necessarily developing them all yourselves. And cognitive is typically from a user experience standpoint, like you just want to make sure that what you're trying to accomplish is not a confusing workflow. So less development on that end, but we'll cover all these, and we're really going to hammer like how to account for users who have visual and motor disabilities. Let's start with visual. Some of the most common visual concerns are users who have color blindness. Again, this is going to come down to a design-related thing. Make sure your color schemes and color patterns are not hitting the pretty common color blindness patterns. So like even you've got like red color blindness, green color blindness, and blue color blindness. You do have users who have total color blindness as well, in which case contrast really starts to make a very important note too. And contrast is that next bit. This is again more of a design-related thing. Just make sure that no one wants to read gray text on gray background. That's just very challenging to read even if you don't have any disabilities at all. And low or no vision. This is where you're getting into the idea of users who are using screen readers. And one big fact that I actually learned about at ThunderPlains is most users who have low or no vision have low vision. It's relatively, I don't want to say rare that a user is completely blind when they're using a site, but compared to the general users who have visual disabilities, they usually can see. It's just low visual function if you're kind of grouping that together. So that's just kind of an eye-opening thing to know there. We always kind of, I think, stereotype like a user with disabilities as having blindness, and I think that's just not. I think that's not an accurate portrayal. So here's kind of a contrast example. This is just not fun to read, no matter what capabilities you have. So motor concerns, and after this we're going to get to those demos that I was telling you about. Motor concerns are, the concepts here are that there are users out there who will have chronic pain and low motor function, and in which case it's very challenging for them to use a mouse. That's kind of a big thing. And there are alternative devices that you can use to scroll around a web page if you can't necessarily use a standard mouse. There's all kinds of fun keyboards and everything. But typically, what a user will do in this situation is they'll just use their keyboard to navigate around. So tabbing through a website to go through all their interactive elements. They'll hit the space bar to scroll down. They'll use arrow keys. They'll hit enter to submit forms. They'll hit escape to get out of modals. Those are all things that you need to be accounted for when you're developing. And there was a good talk at ThunderPlains as well where the talk was titled, "I Never Knew a Website Could Hurt Somebody." And if you genuinely don't account for these kind of things, then you may be causing pain to someone using your website if they're trying to literally navigate around. So we'll go through all the different ways where you can start accounting for users with these kinds of disabilities. So that, I think, gets us to, oh, no, we're about to get to our demo. So before we get to the other disabilities, how do you actually start developing for accessibility? We haven't actually talked about that yet. So can you just use one of those website plugins? And what I mean by that is you've probably been to a website where you've seen this little widget down there, and you click on it, and bam, it brings up this really, what seems like a pretty fancy pop-up and everything for different things like screen reader, voice navigation, smart contrast. Who wouldn't want this? And really the answer is no. You really shouldn't use these. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. But my major ones are they're generally afterthoughts. Like you can't build a house in a very poor way and then put stickers on it to get it up to code or something. The house is still functionally unsafe. And that's kind of the same thing with a website. This really needs to be something that you have to think of. Not necessarily, you're not a failure if you don't think about accessibility from the ground up, but that's obviously, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The best time to think about accessibility was, at that point in time. But we learn and we grow. But if you're looking for a quick fix once the product is launched and you look at these things, you're not getting into the best situation there. And really the reason for that is because they get you 50% of the way there, again, because they're not functionally changing your website. They're overlaying features that they're probably good features, but if your website is not built in the right way in general, then they can't get you very far. And you can very easily get sued. And I actually read an article that said that it's very common for, I don't know what you want to call the population who was like looking to particularly sue like this category of client, but when you see that accessibility marker, it's almost kind of like an indicator of like, oh, let me actually see what this website is doing accessibility-wise beyond this to see if there's anything that, you know, that they are on the hook for legally. So they're just Band-Aids, really. It's like a line item thing for a business person to say like, yes, we support accessibility. Let's call it even. Short answer is no. We don't really want to use those widgets. So again, how do you develop for accessibility? Really, there's two main concepts. You write semantic HTML, and that just means write HTML as HTML is meant to be written. That's like literally what accessibility is. There's very minimal CSS, there's very minimal JavaScript, and accessibility is all front end. There's no like server side accessibility, unless, you know, I'm sure someone could argue something, but really writing semantic HTML, and we'll get into that. And then use ARIA only as needed. Has anyone here ever heard of ARIA before? So ARIA is this thing that you can do with HTML. It stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It allows you to modify your HTML with like HTML attributes. ARIA calls them states and properties. But they're specifically for accessibility features, for assisting screen reading technologies. And really, they can be problematic if you don't know what you're doing. I think when I first was learning about accessibility, I thought, oh, there's this cool thing I can do with HTML to add a bunch of accessibility features, and I got really excited. And that can make things more problematic if you don't know what you're doing. And we'll get into that example. But WebAIM is a very, very big company that cares about accessibility and has wonderful accessibility tools that we'll show off here in a little bit. And they have a really good quote that says, no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. So it's definitely a tool to be, I'm going to skip back a couple slides here. Understanding ARIA, and we'll get into that a little bit, is a wonderful thing, but if you don't know it or don't genuinely understand it, just know that writing like good HTML is like the right answer for accessibility. So I think with that said, oh, last thing. What happens is when you write semantic HTML and when you use ARIA as well, your browser will build what's called this accessibility tree. This is side by side with your DOM tree. It actually uses the DOM tree and then parses out just what it needs to generate for accessibility features. So under the hood, it kind of looks like this. So, you know, again, kind of looks like a DOM tree here, but we don't have every, you know, DOM UI feature here. We just have the actual state that, for example, a screen reader or assistive technology would actually care about. So let's get to our demo, which means it is tea time for me. Okay, so this is public. This is all part of this talk. We're going to go through a few different demos here, and these will go pretty quickly until we get to this last one, and it's still a relatively quick demo, but it's kind of the bigger item. But this is on my GitHub. You can go to just my GitHub, Krauss48, and find developing for accessibility talk, and this has been deployed on the GitHub pages here. So this is all totally public, and I encourage you to check it out after this. And on any page, too, for the demo, you can click this View the Code button, and it'll take you directly to the particular spot for that demo. So this is obviously the repos talk, but as we get to our first demo here, which we'll just go down the line for semantic HTML, we'll click on that. And we can click on View the Code here. It'll take you directly to the specific file. So if you ever are seeing something here and you're like, I wonder how this works, click on this. There's no plugins with any of this. There's no fancy JavaScript libraries. There's no fancy CSS tools. It's literally just vanilla CSS, vanilla JavaScript. I want it to be as easy as possible for someone to take and just run with it. So let's kind of take a step back. So let me kind of take a step back here too. We kind of go through the demos. So semantic HTML, really what I'm getting at here is there's quite a few HTML elements that were introduced in HTML5 that are like all kind of like container elements. You've got like your asides, your sections, your articles, your headers, your footers. You have quite a few of them, and it's not always easy to know what to use when and where, because functionally, like to a user who doesn't necessarily use assistive technologies, you're not going to notice what they do. So that's what this demo focuses on. How to use headings appropriately. Believe it or not, the order of how you use your H1, H2, H3 tags, etc. is very important on a web page. Understanding how to use images properly. I know this seems pretty basic. accessibility is, I kind of want to like break down the barriers. It's not a challenging thing. It's really just kind of understanding why the base fundamentals are the way that they are and why HTML works the way that it does. So we'll talk about images and when to use certain kinds of images, like a background image versus an image tag, a button element versus like an A tag, which is a link, when to use each of those. We'll talk about this concept of skip menus. That's where we're getting into like users who have motor disabilities, how we can tab through pages. And then one of the most interactive ways that a user can interact with the web page is through forms, so which also means if there's high interactivity, there's also, that's probably where we need to start thinking about quite a bit of accessible features there. So we'll get into all that. And these will go pretty quickly again. So semantic HTML, there's really nothing too significant here other than I wanted to provide a pretty simple way for someone to go and know, okay, if I have like a header tag or a nav tag, for example, where might I actually use that on a page? And like what should I actually do with that? We have like the main element here, the article element, a section, a footer, an address. These are all just the container elements that HTML5 adds. And I'm not going to go through all of these and say exactly what they do, but this is more of a, I want to give a visual representation of when and why should I use these kinds of things here. So again, header kind of makes sense there, but here you actually have a visual indication as well as like a little text snippet here to see when to use it. And again, we can look at the code here and it'll take you right here. Now the code's going to look a little bit messy because all the chevrons I have to do like little fancy escapes with, but I bet you can tell they're all in a header here. We've got our main tag in there, etc. So, you know, main tag should be the main content of a page, article and section. Sometimes those are pretty easy to get confused, but an article should be the self-independent bit of content, whereas a section is relatively like just a unique portion of a page that is like, or not unique, but a section, a grouping of something. And on every demo here, I've got like little tips of things that I found pretty helpful to add. And I'll kind of zoom in just a smidge here. Big thing here is if you don't know what semantic HTML container element, you should use a section is usually a safe bet. And it's okay to use divs as well. Like if you're literally, like I think in this example right here, like I have this grouping here, which is like this column on the left and then a column on the right here. Like for column type stuff, there's not really like a nice layout option for that. So I used a div for that. That's totally okay. Like even though all these things like kind of try to replace a lot of what a div does, you can still use a div. So kind of just know that, but the core thing is that when you use these semantic elements the way they're supposed to be used here, then your screen reader can actually start determining what content is important at what stages of your application. It can start to give that indication to a user who's using assistive technologies. So for example, the address field is, or the address element is a pretty interesting one, but it's specifically used for any kind of contact information. So it's not actually like home address, it could be like an email address, just phone number, that kind of thing. But that will give a cue to a user using assistive technologies to know that this is a place for that kind of information. And semantic HTML also means using other elements for their purposes. So like select, which is like a drop-down, input elements, so like text inputs, number inputs, field sets, we'll get into that with the form demo, button, we'll get into that as well. So that's kind of this bit. The big thing is if you ever need to know or want a visual representation of where to use what element and what spot, this is what I think is an okay way to lay out a page. Let's kind of keep going. So headings here, this is one of the more interesting ones. When you use headings on a page, you really want to stick with one H1 tag. That's kind of your main title of the page. I've seen various articles that try to refute the importance of that, and every time I keep seeing the importance of really just sticking to one main purpose of a web page. To really just have one H1 tag. And here's kind of the big thing with headings. You need to make sure that when you use your headings on a page, you don't skip down a bunch of headings. What I mean by that is if I have an H1 up here, I should not naturally put an H3 directly underneath that. I should put an H2 if I have a subheading. And underneath that H2, like you can see here, I have an H3. Now I can put another H3 right beside that. You can have the same sibling levels and everything. And you might think, what if my designs have like a larger heading underneath a smaller heading, but like the larger heading is actually like it's like a subsidiary of the smaller heading. I've worked with designs with that before, and that's where you have CSS come in. So take this example right here. We have an H4 right here, and this is obviously larger. User experience wise, probably not the best because it makes you think it's like an actual like larger header, but this is accessible. This is actually an H4. I can inspect this element right here. And there's our H4 right there. We just have a font size of 2 rem on there, which is what makes it bigger. And that's totally fine. We can use CSS to modify sizing. That's not going to impede accessibility there. Now, let's kind of look at our pattern here. We have an H1, we went down to H2, we went down to H3, we had another H3, which is fine. We went down H4, and then we go right back up to an H2. And that's okay. And I know this probably seems like the most confusing thing in the world, but you've done this before, like in like everyday life. And if you've ever done like an unordered list, like a bulleted list, it literally works like that. So think about this. You have like an H1, it's like a top level bullet. You can't, whenever you have a bulleted list, you can't like go down. Like you can't have like 10 indentations on the next line. That wouldn't make any sense. But when you're done with one set of indentations, you can go back up as far as you need to. It's literally the same with like your heading tags here. So that's kind of the big cue to remember here. This is a common problem as far as accessibility goes on a lot of web pages. There's that company WebAIM that I was telling you about. They will do this. They have what's called the WebAIM Million, where I think every year they will look at the top 1,000,000 sites that are viewed by the most people, and they'll determine like what accessibility bugs they have. And this one comes up quite often, like, oh, you went from an H1 to an H3 on a web page. Well, that just makes it harder for assistive technologies to really start building that like logic tree that they actually need to tell the users about. So images and figures here. We have 3 pictures of 2 beautiful bears each here, but they're all actually a little bit different. So this is a background image, and if I look at the inspect element here, this is a background image, so this is just a div. We have like an image tag right here. If I kind of scroll down to this guy, this is an image tag. And if I scroll down one more, this is a figure, which is a new HTML5. I shouldn't say new, I think HTML5 came out in 2010, but newer HTML5 element, which does have an image inside of it, but it also has this fig caption and everything here. And those are all like functionally a little bit different. And the big cue that I want to talk about here is if you have an image on your site that is an actual portion of content on your site, like if it's genuinely important, if the site won't make as much sense without this image, then it needs to actually be an image tag. It should not be a background image, which is what this thing is right here. Because one of the big reasons for that is with image tags, you can provide alternative text. You can set the alt text on it to let your assistive technologies know what the actual content of that image is. You cannot do that on a background image here. And also, if you've ever noticed on a web page, if you click on some images and you can hit this like copy image or save image as, or if I click on this one, I don't get that at all. Well, that's why. It's because they're probably background images. So if it's going to frustrate, so we're kind of getting beyond just like if you're a privileged user who doesn't have any disabilities, this is still going to frustrate you in some way. I can't tell you how many times I've been to a web page where I want to copy an image and I can't do it. And then thankfully I like know how to use the console and I can like find the image on there. But that would frustrate any user there. Historically, background images were easier to style than an image tag. That's not as much the case anymore. With like there's a relatively newer, or I should say well-supported CSS property called like object fit. I think that really gives you the same capabilities of an image tag that a background image had. So really at this point in time, I couldn't imagine why you would still want to use a background image for strictly stylistic purposes, but this is more just for your information. Background images are fine to use, but use them if it makes sense, if it's okay for them to not even be there at all. Like just kind of a cover image or something like that is totally perfect. So background images are great for website aesthetics, not significant content. Image tags are good for significant content. And if you don't need a label, if you do need a label for an image that you want a user to, like all users to see, that's where your figure plus a caption come in. And you might wonder like, okay, well if I put a caption with an image, do I still need my alt text with it? And you do, and they're different. They're actually different. They should not be the same text. So your caption should be like what the actual description is of the image, what you actually want to convey. Be artistic. Be what you want the actual user to see. The alt text should actually describe what the image functionally is. So this figure down here has a caption of "Bears are nice and fluffy." It's beautifully written. But the alt text is 2 majestic bears standing. It's just, that's what it is. We're not trying to like paint a picture there. So that's kind of some functional differences there. Tips, big thing, I think we've covered all these. Use alt text. You cannot do that on background images. So just again, background images are fine to use. Make sure you're using them for the right reasons. Image alt text should be functional. Fig caption text should be pretty description. We already talked about background images here. And there is a relatively new HTML element called the picture element, which really, I'm not going to talk about that one much, but it allows you to provide different images at different screen sizes. Functionality-wise, accessibility-wise, that's going to be similar to an image tag there. So all the same concerns here that you would have are totally fine with that. Let's talk about buttons and links after my tea break here. Okay, we're just moving on with the rule of threes here. We have 3 more comparisons here. They all look relatively similar, right? But this is actually an anchor tag, so that's like an example of what this is right here, an A tag. We have a button tag right here, which is what this is going to look like right here. And we have another button tag, but there's a difference here. This one is of type equals button. This one is of type equals submit. All of these make these 3 very different experiences. And let's talk about when you would use, and notice how they're all styled the same. Again, accessibility doesn't care about the styling as much. Sometimes, if you say display none, that is a caveat. Your accessibility tree will read that. But in general, how big something is, the colors, it's not going to care about that. So when should you use like an A tag versus a button tag? Well, the core thing there is if you are going somewhere, if you are navigating somewhere, use an anchor tag. That's an A tag. If you want your button that takes you somewhere to look like a button that clicks like this, that's okay. This is still an A tag. You can style it however you want to. Just because something in the design looks like a button or looks like a link, that doesn't necessarily mean HTML-wise you should use an A tag or a button. You have to kind of think about what's the goal of this action. So when I click this button, it takes me back. Like that's an A tag right there. So when I go back here, versus when I click this button, I'm not, a button tag with a type of button should do something where it really like keeps you on the same page. It's not navigating you somewhere. And I click on this and generates an alert. It says you triggered some behavior instead of navigating to a new URL. We did it. So that's kind of when you should use a button. Now, by default, a button tag, if you don't specify a type on it, it will be a type submit. And that will get you quite often. I'm sure that a lot of front-end developers here have been bitten by that before. And you'll wonder, like, why is my whole page refreshing when I click this button? Well, that's why. If you set it to type button, that's not going to happen. It will just run whatever function you tell it to do, and it'll be the end of that. Now, if you have a form, which is what this is right here, you do want to type submit on that because you actually want to submit the form. That's a logical behavior right there. So in this example here, if I said like my name is Aaron, and I hit submit, it's going to print my name out right there. Beautiful form. And that's a type submit right there. And notice how it would refresh the page, but this is where you get into the thoughts of like, well, I prevented the default behavior from preventing the page, which is an okay thing to do. Just kind of, we'll talk a little bit about that with the form submission. Yeah, we got a question.
Given that someone's using a screen reader, how are these options actually presented differently to them?
So question is, given someone's using a screen reader, how are these options necessarily presented differently to them? So what your screen reader will do is it will look at this type button right here, this type tag right here, and how it necessarily alerts the user will just be typically with voice activation there. It'll let them know with voice. But let's kind of talk about the accessibility tree just a little bit. So your website will actually generate this, let me see, I think it's right in here. Yeah, so it will actually, let me stretch that out a little bit. You can actually look in your dev tools like what your website will actually do. So let's actually take a look at that and kind of see if we can kind of figure out what that's looking like. So we've got that there. We can look at all the ARIA attributes. Let me hide that, see if we can get into this main attribute there. So as we kind of scroll down, there's a way you can link up this particular button with the accessibility tree. I don't know how to do that. So let's kind of look at that, our button element right there. So it should have let's kind of compare that. So we've got our roll of button right there. Let's kind of compare that with our section down towards the bottom with this guy. So we're right in there. So we've still got our roll of button down there. In some shape or form, it does let the user know with a screen reader that it is a submit versus a type button. So beyond this, I don't think I could tell you. But good question.
Will your whole web page refresh if you have a button that's outside form with no type specified?
So will the whole page refresh if you have a button that's outside of a form with no type specified? I think if you don't have a button, if you have the button with no type specified and you click on it, I believe in general, yes, that's going to refresh the form. I don't think you necessarily need the form to trigger the submit behavior. Don't quote me on that, but I would bet 90%. That's,
Doesn't the form usually tell you where it's going to submit?
so you can still, yes, so on the form, you can tell like on submit handler there, but I believe the default behavior of a button with the type set to submit will still just refresh the page. I believe that's the case. I probably have to like test it out to see. But good question. All right, let's kind of get into skip menus and tab orders here. So we're getting into users who have motor disabilities here. So, you know, if I wanted to scroll down and look at this footer right here and click on it, I could do that with the mouse. It's not a problem for me. But if I can't scroll, if I can't move my mouse, how do I do that? Well, that's kind of where you get into tab order. And that's the second thing we're talking about here, but let's talk about that first. If I tab through a page and I'm going through, then I should be able to like naturally see where my tabs go. So that's tab order. You really don't want to mess with that. And what you can do is if you use some fun tools like like Flexbox, let me kind of put something here. So I'll put a display flex on that and we'll set the flex direction to like row reverse or something like that. Well, now we've tampered with the tab order. So if I go here, my next tab goes there. It's like I'm tabbing backwards, and then I kind of keep going. So this is pretty easy to do with you can use CSS in this case to botch up your accessibility flow by using things like floats, by using reverse directions. And there's really no substitute for testing this other than just kind of like manually going through and testing and tabbing through a website. And I really encourage everyone to tab through your website and kind of indicate. And you'll kind of notice as I'm tabbing, like there's these styles that are the same as the hover styles. That's happening. I actually like to do that when I'm developing sites where I just say, okay, whatever my hover styles are, let's just put the focus styles as the same on that. Most browsers are pretty good at giving you an indication. Like I did not style that right there. This is Chrome styling. Most browsers are pretty good at giving you an indication of where you're focused on something, but you can override that. The thing that you should not do is you should not remove that. That is not an okay thing to do because you need to give your user an understanding of where they're at on the page. And this is getting beyond users with visual disabilities. Like a user may have complete visual capability and they are tabbing through the site because it's painful for them to use a mouse, for example. So that's a tab order there. Let's talk about that skip menu thing up there. Let me refresh this page. So let's say that I have a really extensive menu on a site, this like menu right here. This is only 4 items, it's not very extensive, but let's say I had 100 items. It would be a pain to have to tab through that every single time I loaded up a page. So most websites, like a good website will have what's called a skip menu, and that's when I start tabbing. This thing will pop up that says skip directly to content, or you can have it really say whatever you want it to be. But it's only there when I'm focused. I can't hover, I can't click on anything. It's just there when I hit tab. And I hit enter, and let's see what happens if I don't hit enter. If I keep tabbing, we go up there, we go to the menu, and then we get to the content there. Whereas if I tab backwards, I'm just doing a shift tab there. If I hit enter when this is focused, then if I hit tab again, it shifts me to a new section of the page, like where my focus is. If you've never seen this before, this may look like a little bit complex. There is no JavaScript involved in this. There is strictly like a minimal amount of HTML and a minimal amount of CSS with this. Literally, if you think about it, we just have an element up here that's hidden until you're focused on it, and that's a CSS selector there. So once we're focused on it, then we actually position this link, this menu item, to a certain page. And you can tell it actually navigates us somewhere. We went to hashtag content there, which is an ID on the page. So again, there's no JavaScript involved in that. That's just how HTML works. So suffice it to say that if you have a web page that has a menu of any kind, you really want to give your user the ability to skip past that menu, because when I navigate to a new page, my tab focus refreshes. You don't want to require your user to have to keep tabbing through the same menu over and over again. It's very frustrating, and this is the way that we account for that. So last demo here is a reasonably accessible form, and I'll kind of get into like what's reasonably accessible about this. But it looks like a pretty simple form. We've got a name, an email, and are you enjoying OKC WebDevs, and a few of the languages that I can somewhat speak. So let's go ahead and submit it. If I say Aaron, I'll say aaron@clever.com, and we'll say yes there. So if I hit submit, great, thank you. If I say ja in German, so Dankeschön, that's how we say thank you. And then C is gracias, Aaron. So, you know, it's a fun little form and everything, but there's, you know, and it probably looks pretty simple, but there's actually quite a bit involved in this that kind of becomes second nature when you start getting into accessibility features. But let's kind of break this down bit by bit. So let's kind of go through the tips for that. For starters, placeholder text is not a label. So you'll notice I'm not using this text right here to identify that it's a name field. Placeholder text should be an example of what you want to put in. So Jane Doe is an example of a name. That's what I want to put in there. So it's very common to see designs out there where this assumes that it's the label. And truth be told, you can account for that with HTML by like providing a hidden label and everything such that a screen reader can read it. But one, that's not usually the right answer. And two, imagine if I loaded up this web page and it had an information in there and this name field, this name label was not there. Like, what is this field? Like, I wouldn't know. And then I would have to like delete this field to kind of see what is, okay, so it would be the name, for example, and then we're also getting into contrast. We don't have the best contrast here. Like, labels are a thing. We should use those. And that kind of gets into the next bit here. You need an actual visible label that's tied to the field it's labeling. So you've probably seen a lot of form fields where if you click on the label, it focuses you on the field. There's no magic involved in that. That's just, we specify the HTML. There's a for element, a for attribute. Let me kind of move that over. We have this for attribute here that ties to the ID of the actual input. That's it, no magic there. And that's a very, very simple thing to do. You just have to ID your input elements. And you can tell as I'm clicking there, as I'm clicking here, same things here. So that is not only is it great for like user experience here, but this all becomes part of the accessibility tree. Now, you need to indicate your required fields both visually and with HTML attributes. So visually, we've got the red asterisk. Great. It's like gives your users a cue. It doesn't have to be the red asterisk, but like some kind of visual indication that the field is required. And if we try to submit, we do have like custom validation here, which we'll kind of get into that a little bit. But if you notice, let me refresh this page. If I look at this element, we do actually have the HTML required flag on here. And there is a way that you can specify an ARIA element. And first of all, let me preface and say we haven't used ARIA on anything. Like, none of those previous demos used ARIA whatsoever, and they're totally accessible. We do use a little bit here, and I'll get into what we're using. But we're specifying this HTML required field here, this required attribute. That's just HTML. That's not ARIA or anything. There is an ARIA-required property you can add, but again, kind of thinking about, there's a rule with ARIA. The first rule of ARIA is if you can use semantic HTML, do that instead, and then look at ARIA. So there's semantic HTML that says required here. So this is specifying that it's a required field to our screen readers. Make sure you have good focus indication. So again, most browsers will do this by default. I didn't add anything new to this, but as we're focused, you can see that blue outline there, blue outline there, blue outline there, and we can hit arrow up and down here because we're using semantic HTML. Let's kind of keep going there. I know it's a lot to think about here, but it's kind of like this, if you kind of go step by step with the different tips here, and as you start to build this, it kind of starts to become second nature. Hitting enter should submit a form. Again, this is the default behavior. I didn't build anything for this, but if I hit enter and I'm in a form, it's going to submit the form. It's going to try to, at least. That's a pretty good thought too. A lot of the times, like, the default behavior is the right behavior. It's when we start trying to get fancy with other features that we can override default behaviors, and that kind of like trickles down into a bunch of other problems. We should group related fields like a radio button, radio buttons or checkboxes together with these HTML elements called field sets and legends. So, and those might be some elements that you might not have heard about before, but they're actually really powerful. So this is a field set right here, and this is just the default style for at least Chrome for this field. And this legend attribute is for defining the name or the category of like this field set right here. And inside of here, I have like my radio buttons in there. But because they're all inside of a field set here, this allows me to kind of navigate up and down like this. And they're also named appropriately. They all have the same name, which is how HTML groups them all together there. But screen reading wise, grouping them together in this kind of field set is how we can, this is the proper way to group like a checkbox or a radio set, a radio group like this together. And then the last thing I'll really add is there are definitely times where you need to use ARIA states and properties. An example of here is, you know, when we don't have the form submitted, it looks great. When we do submit a form, if there's validation errors, well, now we're getting into things that we've done that there just is no semantic HTML for. There's no semantic HTML for, hey, this field is invalid and it's invalid because of this reason. So that's where we start having to kind of use some of the new capabilities of ARIA. So in this case, we did introduce our very first use case of ARIA. So I'll just show that real quick. We didn't do anything crazy. All we used was this ARIA invalid on the elements themselves. We say that the element is described by this certain area, like this certain text, and it has a role of alert. And that just is a cue to a screen reader to say, hey, this is really important, look at this right now. You don't want to overdo that because that's not, you don't want to redirect a flow like that and that intensive. But if we kind of look at this field now has ARIA invalid equals true on there, and it's ARIA described by name error, and that's the ID of this particular field right here. And this has a role of alert. So those are like the three really ARIA-related things that we've done here. And as I, fill that out, great, it goes away. It's no longer invalid. And this form actually, like now that that field is not valid, it actually shifts me to the next invalid field that needs fixing. So this probably looks like a nice, fully accessible form. There's always going to be things you can do more. And an example of things that I haven't done are I didn't group the errors at the top of the form with like links to the exact errors. I didn't like do validation updates on blur or change. Like as you start typing, the validation message still sticks there. Right now you have to submit the form with JavaScript, whereas what if someone didn't have JavaScript enabled? They wouldn't be able to use this form. So there's always things you could do, and I kind of linked to a really cool demo that just does a lot of those things. So for example, I try to submit a form. It shows all those up here. I click on that. It takes me directly to that link. There's just always going to be more you can do, and this is kind of, don't let accessibility overwhelm you. Like if you do one thing better today than you did yesterday, that's the right way to think about it. You have the rest of your life to like get better at this stuff. So that's kind of done with the demos, and I know we're coming up on time and we'll be wrapping up here in just a couple minutes. So we haven't talked about like auditory or cognitive concerns, and again, these are, you can certainly develop for these, but auditory concerns are mostly involving, like auditory content, so like video content, as a lot of, or strictly audio content. But really what you want to do is use subtitles, you want to make sure you have volume controls, and ideally default to a muted state. Nobody, despite any disabilities, wants to see your video pop up on a page and just audio start going. And the reason why I didn't talk about this much with development-wise is because my recommendation is just to use YouTube or Vimeo for any kind of video content. They just do this really well. And if you have strictly audio content, there's providers for that as well. Cognitive concerns, again, this kind of gets into a lot of user experience type things and that we're not going to focus on development-wise. And really, you need to have good content. You need to have a good user experience for every user. But there's this really powerful thing that's panic mode that it's kind of a fun thing, not a fun thing, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And think about when you go to visit certain websites, like a hospital, a school, a local news or weather site. There is a chance you're going there because you just wanted to read the new blog post of the day. But there's also a real chance that you are wondering, like, what is the ER number, so I can get like a direct line. Is my child's school closed today because it's 10 minutes before we're about to leave? Or is there a tornado that's going to hit more today again, or anywhere? But you're in a different mindset when you're in those states. And that's like what panic mode is. So if you're building a website for an example of these kinds of industries, think about that. Like, what should like your main use case be? And again, this comes back to more of a user experience type thing, but I think it's kind of an eye-opener as a developer. As development, I think we're always empowered to like be a part of the whole picture. So even if we're not, even if we necessarily don't develop till we get the designs, like kind of knowing what the concerns are is going to be really helpful. And then there's a bonus disability that I'm going to put a drum roll here, and that is data disability. And that's just that a lot of users across the world don't necessarily have unlimited data plans, and you have to kind of account for that. So, or fast connections. So I'm sure that 2 megabyte image you put on your website is beautiful and everything, but it could probably be like a 100 kilobyte image instead. So what can you do instead? Well, you can optimize your images. That's a good example right there. Make sure you're putting the right size image on the right page. That's all, nice and optimized. Minify and tree shake your CSS and JavaScript. A lot of build tools will do this for you automatically. So Vite, Webpack, Rollup. I'm sure there's like 3 more I could just make up on the fly. Don't overdo it with custom fonts. You have to download those on your web page typically every time, so that's just something to be accounting for. And then caching. This is usually something your web server will do, so you don't really have to think about it, but it's kind of something where you can just make sure that you're utilizing the most efficient caching that your web server can provide, like gzip or something. Here's a good example. The entire Super Mario Brothers file size was 31 kilobytes. This image is 410 kilobytes. So just kind of puts everything into perspective there. So last minute awesome tools. We didn't really go over these, but Wave is by WebAIM, which is a cool accessibility tool. If you ever want to see how a certain website works for, like accessibility, this will determine all of, the issues accessibility-wise, UI-wise, code-wise, etc. With the site, and it will give you like actual things you can do, and this is by WebAIM. And then that WebAIM million is the other thing I was telling you about. They analyze the top 1,000,000 home pages for like the world's most viewed sites, and they break everything down that they see quite often. And what we've covered today covers like the vast majority of everything. So this is all like the important stuff to know. So it really is like front-end HTML specific stuff. So I'll share this link. This is just the link for the demos that we went through. There's the GitHub repo. And remember, Simba, baby steps. Don't think you have to like do all this today. Don't think you have to do all this yesterday. Just do, one step at a time. Because if you let this overwhelm you, just like anything in life, it will overwhelm you. So just give yourself that grace to learn it. It's, you can always get better with everything. So just kind of take it one step at a time. So that's all that I have got. That is me. Thank you so much.